In January of 1996, a fisherman drilling through the ice of Lake Harrow in rural northern Minnesota made a discovery that had nothing to do with fish. Beneath the frozen surface, suspended in the dark water like a forgotten question, was a single leather glove. A woman's glove. Dark brown, size small, stitched with a small floral pattern at the wrist. It was an odd thing to find, the kind of thing you'd note and move on from. He pulled it out, set it on the ice, and went home. He never knew he had just found the only physical evidence left behind by a killer. 28 years later, that glove would bring a man to his knees in a courtroom and finally give a name, a real, human name, to what had happened to Margaret Elaine Dowd. Margaret was 31 years old when she disappeared in November of 1995. She lived alone in a small two-bedroom house on the outskirts of Halverton, a quiet town of about 4,000 people sandwiched between pine forests and the glacial lakes that define that part of Minnesota. She worked as a bookkeeper for a local lumber contractor, coached youth soccer on Saturdays, and called her mother every Sunday evening without fail. She had never missed a single Sunday call in 11 years. On the evening of November 14th, 1995, her mother called. And called again. And again. Margaret never answered. Her coworkers noticed she hadn't come in on the 15th. Her neighbor noticed her car hadn't moved. By the 16th, her mother had driven 4 hours from Rochester and was standing on her daughter's porch, knocking on a door that didn't open. She called the Halverton Police Department that afternoon. Officers arrived, found no signs of forced entry, Margaret's purse still on the kitchen counter, her coat missing. There were dishes in the sink. A half-drunk cup of coffee still sitting on the table. Margaret Dowd had simply stepped out of her life. The initial investigation moved quickly, but without traction. There were no witnesses. No one had seen her leave. Interviews with friends, co-workers, and the few people she'd been in casual conflict with, a neighbor dispute over a fence line, a former boyfriend who'd moved to Wisconsin, turned up nothing concrete. Detectives found no evidence of a struggle inside the house. No blood. No signs that anything violent had taken place inside those walls. What they did find, eventually, was a tire track in the soft mud at the edge of a logging access road about 2 miles east of her house. A single, partial impression, consistent with a mid-size pickup truck. And that was it. That was the sum total of physical evidence linked to Margaret's disappearance. The case went cold within 8 months. The detective who led the investigation, a man named Roy Pelchat, would later say in an interview that he never stopped thinking about Margaret. He kept her file on the corner of his desk for the next 12 years, until he retired. The glove, meanwhile, sat in an evidence bag in a county property room. It had been logged, photographed, and analyzed in 1996. No no fingerprints, no match to Margaret's known belongings. Her mother confirmed she didn't recognize it. So it sat. Tagged, forgotten, one of thousands of objects collected at the margins of crimes that were never fully solved. For 28 years, Margaret Dowd was a name that appeared in true crime forums, in a short chapter of a regional book about cold cases, and in the memories of the people who loved her. Her mother, Eleanor Dowd, gave an interview to a local newspaper every November on the anniversary of the disappearance. She never stopped. Even at 79 years old, she was still showing up, still saying her daughter's name, still asking for anyone who knew anything to come forward. In 2022, the Halverton Police Department partnered with the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension in a cold case review initiative. A forensic investigator named Dana Sills was assigned to the Dowd file as part of a broader effort to reprocess old evidence using modern techniques. Sills later described opening the Dowd box for the first time as one of the more sobering moments of her career. There wasn't much inside. But the glove was there. By 2023, forensic technology had advanced to the point where touched DNA, the microscopic cellular material transferred to a surface through simple contact, could be extracted and profiled from objects that had previously yielded nothing. The glove was sent to a private lab in Colorado that specialized in degraded biological material. Weeks passed. And then the lab called back. There was DNA. Partial, but workable. A male contributor, unknown. The profile was uploaded to CODIS, the National DNA Database. No hit. The person who had touched that glove had never been arrested for anything that required a DNA sample. But that wasn't the end of the road. It was the beginning of another one. Because in 2023, investigators also had access to genealogical DNA databases, the same technology that had cracked the Golden State Killer case and dozens of others since. With the partial profile and the assistance of a genealogical analyst, detectives began constructing a family tree from the DNA. The work took 7 months. It led them to a man named Gerald Forsett, 64 years old, who had spent his entire adult life in Cass County, Minnesota, roughly 40 miles from Halverton. He was a former logging contractor. He had owned a mid-size pickup truck in 1995. He had no criminal record. And in November of 1995, according to a former co-worker who remembered only because Forsett had borrowed money during that period, Gerald Forsett had been in severe financial distress, with 2 outstanding loans from private parties, one of whom was the lumber company that employed Margaret Dowd as its bookkeeper. Investigators obtained a discarded coffee cup from outside a gas station where Forsett was observed. The DNA was a match to the glove. In March of 2024, Gerald Forsett was arrested at his home in Brainerd, Minnesota. Detectives simultaneously executed a search warrant on his property and, in a drainage area at the back of his 40-acre parcel, found human remains that were later confirmed through dental records to belong to Margaret Elaine Dowd. Forsett said nothing to investigators during his arrest. He had nothing to say during his arraignment either. But evidence recovered from the property told enough of the story. Margaret had known something about financial irregularities in the company's books, irregularities that pointed to Forsett. The prosecution's theory was that Forsett had reached out to her, lured her from her home under the pretense of discussing a work matter, and killed her to keep her silent. The glove, prosecutors argued, had been lost during the disposal of her body near Lake Harrow, where Forsett had likely driven along the logging access road before the ground froze solid in December. The tire track impressions from 1996 had been consistent with the make and model of his truck. Gerald Forsett was convicted of first-degree murder in October of 2024. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Eleanor Dowd was in the courtroom when the verdict was read. She was 81 years old. She had been showing up for 29 years. After the sentencing, she gave a brief statement on the courthouse steps and said only this, that she hoped her daughter finally knew she was never forgotten. Not for a single day. A fisherman pulled a glove from a frozen lake and thought nothing of it. A detective kept a file on the corner of his desk for 12 years. A mother made the same drive to the same courthouse for nearly 3 decades. A forensic investigator opened a dusty evidence box and decided it was worth trying again. That is sometimes how justice works. Not fast, not dramatic. Slowly, stubbornly, by the hands of people who refuse to let a name become only a name. Margaret Dowd was 31 years old. She called her mother every Sunday. She coached youth soccer. She kept books in a careful hand. Now you know her story.